Alright, so today I'm going to review kind of a new process for repairing scratches in the Summit wood floor. What I've got today is we're going to be using the regular Stanley scraper that you've seen before, and I'm introducing, I have a second scraper. I'd recommend buying a second Stanley one. These are pretty cheap and don't work too well. But I did a different process than what we practiced originally. And what I did is I added some little serrations in the blade. And I'll show you how to do that here in a minute. But essentially what we're doing is to get these tooling marks back into the wood. I don't know if you can see that, but to get these tooling marks back in the wood is really difficult with the original process. We tried a couple of different things with loosening the blade, and by doing that you get really small chatter marks, but to get these big sufficient ones that tend to be in the wood quite a bit, I just modified a blade, and after we scrape it back, we take this, and instead of, we actually go across the grain, all in the right direction, same direction. You have to be careful not to have different angles on that piece of board. You have to keep it pretty consistent from one board to the next. Once we apply that, apply those tooling marks, we can then add our line back into the wood. And once we add that, then instead of sanding it down, which I found takes a while, clumps up the sandpaper, I found we go back to our Stanley scraper and we actually scrape back on the wood, and that reveals, keeps that deep lime down into the tooling marks, keeps that there, and takes off just the top coat. Once you do that, you usually do a final sand with sandpaper, and then from there we're going to take our refresh oil, depending on if you got the 5% white oil or the regular refresh oil. We're going to oil that in. We're going to take our scrubbing pad and scrub that into it. Let that sit for a minute or two, and then do our final wipe with a terry cloth, and we'll wipe. Okay, so for your scraper, what you want to do is pick a point about every, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch or so, and just take your file, usually one that you got file on the edge, and take it, hold it about a 45-degree angle or so, both hands. And what you want to do is you make sure that you vary your spacing a bit, and remember this has to look natural, so you don't want to have it the exact same spacing on every single one. Now if you have these that are too wide, that tends to not look very good on the planks. So what I would do is just cut those down or so. So again, about every, I don't know, 3/16, 1/8 of an inch or so. Just kind of vary your tool marks. You have to remember that every space that you remove material, it's not going to scratch there. It's only going to scratch on these high points. One other tip is after you've added your serrations, you may have to go back and just real lightly resharpen the blade. If you buy the Stanley blades, they come pretty sharp. If you buy anything else that I've tried out, they tend to be pretty dull from the get-go. And just a little bit on the back. So you need to have that guy nice and sharp in order to scrape that wood back. So now what we're going to do is we're going to test our newly made piece on a scrap piece of wood. Recommend getting a couple planks and just clamping them down to your workbench, and this is a great way to practice your technique before taking it out on the floor. So I've already taken my scraper and made a nice smooth area to test here, and now I'm going to take my new tool. Just add a couple of marks, and I'm going to do the whole process start to finish and take a look and see how these tooling marks look. Okay, so went back, added a few more cuts or grooves into it, came back, redid the process, and now I'm getting to a point where I like the tooling marks I'm seeing. These look a little bit more consistent than what I tend to see. Also, if you want to do it, a single pass may render just a few tooling marks, which is kind of nice because then you can do a couple of passes to add tooling marks back into it, make it a little more dense. So it's just kind of one neat trick you can do. Depending on what the boards look like, if they have just a few or a bunch, you can kind of vary the amount of passes that you do to try and replicate that. So with that, I'd probably be ready to take this out on the floor and do a final repair. With this guy, I still need to oil it and give it a final sand then re-oil, and then call it good. But this is just my test piece, again, just to make sure that my grooves look like I want them to look. Alright, so here's a close-up of the scratch that we're going to work on. As you can see, this is a really pretty deep scratch. We may not be able to dig this down enough to actually remove this. Some other challenges with this scratch is that it's right up next to this other board, so we're only going to work on this piece here in this section, and then also this area right here. I chose this one because I don't know if you can see it, but there's really tiny serration tooling marks on this board, and on this one there's hardly any. So when you're repairing these, you have to be really cognizant of looking at the tooling marks because you're going to have to replicate that in your final process. So it's really dependent on what boards you have and what tooling marks are there will kind of dictate your process and how you want to replicate that. So we're going to take our Stanley scraper, the straight blade, it's nice and tight, and you're just going to go through and carefully plane this back. And you're going to plane back pretty much until you can no longer see that scratch. Okay, so I got down almost to the bottom of it. I can still see a little bit of lines there. I don't want to go too deep. Remember, I've only got 1/8 of an inch on this board. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of sandpaper and just carefully try and take out any remaining spots that we have in that scratch. And it's okay if you don't get it perfect. You know, this wood has flaws in it. It's got natural flaws. You don't need to get everything completely out. But I think that right there is probably going to be about as good as we're going to get. So what we need to do now is just do quick light sand, and we have to add these tooling marks back. So I take this guy and I take a look at the direction of the marks in this board, and I'm just going to work at one board at a time. And I see there's a bunch of little tooling marks and they're all in this direction. So what I want to do is try and emulate that. Just like that. You may not be able to see it too much in the video, but once we add the lime, you should start to kind of see where those marks come into play. On this board, they're pretty faint, so I don't need to add too much. Just like that. You don't want to overdo it. You really don't need much. Alright, so next process, I've got my gloves on. We're going to be using our lime, so I've just got a little piece of an old rag or something, and this little process, get it wet, and what you want to do is just kind of work this in to the area that you just added those tooling marks in. And you really don't need much. You can overdo this step really easily, and it all kind of depends on how the surrounding boards look. If the surrounding boards don't have much lime, then don't overdo this process. Okay. So next what I'm going to do is take my blade again, straight blade, and you really don't need to let that dry too much because I'm going to be scraping it, and just lightly come back over the top. I'm not putting much pressure on it. I'm just trying to scrape off that top layer. And what that does is kind of replicate some of that random tooling to it. Once I do that, I'm going to take my 150 grit sandpaper and just finish the process, trying to blend it in with the surrounding area. I don't know if you can see, but this lime ends up being a little bit lighter color than what's in the surrounding area. You know, this is nice and fresh. What's around here has kind of been sitting here for a while, about a year now, so it's a little bit darker. So what I'm going to do now is take a little bit of this oyster color, and we're just going to darken that up a little bit. Again, you don't need a whole lot. And I'm just going to rub that right into those tooling marks. Alright, so now that we've done that, we're going to take our oil, spread it around any areas that you sanded or scraped back. It's going to need to be re-oiled. And take your white scrubbing pad and just scrub that back into place. Okay, so I've cleaned up my workspace, kind of got things tidied up. This is sat for, you know, a minute or two. So I'm just going to take a white terry cloth and just give it a final wipe just to try and remove any excess oil. You can see that blended, you know, pretty well. Our old scratch was right across this line, and now you can hardly even see it. That was the whole process, start to finish, how to refinish a board. If you have any questions, reach out to your regional facility trainer, regional facility manager, and we can definitely walk you through it if you have issues. So thanks for watching the video, and have fun taking care of your Summit wood floors.